The war was supposed to last 6 weeks. It lasted 4 years. The plan failed on day 1, and nobody told the soldiers. Welcome to the trench.
In August of 1914, the generals on both sides had a plan. It was not a plan for trenches. It was not a plan for years. It was a plan for weeks, a rapid campaign of manoeuvre, a decisive battle, a clean conclusion. The German plan assumed France would collapse in 6 weeks. The French plan assumed Germany could be pushed back by the sheer force of the offensive spirit. Both plans had one thing in common. Neither of them had a contingency for what actually happened. By November of 1914, a line of trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 250 miles of dug earth, mud and wire. It had not been designed. It had been arrived at. Each side had tried to outflank the other and found the flank already covered. Each side had tried to advance and found the machine gun waiting. And so both sides dug. And what they dug became the defining geography of a generation. Think of the trench not as a ditch, but as an underground city, built without architects, without plans, without any intention of permanence. The frontline trench was typically 7 feet deep and wide enough for 2 men to pass. Behind it ran a communication trench, the corridor connecting the front to the rear. Behind that, support trenches, and behind those, reserve positions. The whole system, on the British sector alone, eventually stretched to more than 6,000 miles of excavation, more than the distance from London to New York. The men who dug it had no idea they were building something that would still be there, in fragments, 150 years later. The trench was cold. Not the cold of a winter morning you could step back inside from, the cold of a place that never dried, never warmed, never changed. The walls seeped water. The floor was mud, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes deeper. Boards were laid to walk on. They sank. Rats moved along the walls at night, large ones, fed on things that no one wanted to name. The daily rhythm was built around 2 moments of danger, dawn and dusk. At those times, called Stand To, every soldier stood at the fire step and looked toward the enemy line. 45 minutes of absolute alertness. Twice a day, every day, for years. In between, the work, repairing walls, draining water, carrying supplies, sleeping in 2-hour intervals, writing letters, waiting. Most men, for most of the war, never saw the enemy at all. They lived in holes in the ground and waited for orders that rarely came. And when they came, usually meant walking into a machine gun. The letters from the trenches, millions of them, surviving in archives across Europe and the Commonwealth, carry a common note by early 1915. Not despair, in most cases. Something more precise than despair, a kind of bewildered endurance. Men who had expected a war and found something that had no name yet, who had been told they were fighting for something clear and found themselves living in a ditch, in the mud, in the cold, watching the same 20 yards of wire they had watched the week before and the week before that. They wrote home about the cold, the mud, the boredom, the rats. They asked about the harvest. They asked about the dog. They did not, for the most part, describe what it was like when the artillery came, because there were no words for it yet, and because they did not want to frighten the people they had left behind. Here is the central fact of the Western Front, and it is a technological one. The machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute. A man crossing open ground, even at a sprint, was exposed for somewhere between 15 and 45 seconds. The mathematics was not complicated. What was complicated, what would cost millions of lives to resolve, was the refusal of military doctrine on both sides to accept what the mathematics meant. The frontal infantry attack had been the primary tactic of European warfare for centuries. The machine gun had made it suicidal, and yet the frontal attack remained the primary tactic until almost the end of the war, because stopping it meant admitting, publicly and officially, that the strategy had been wrong from the beginning. Artillery was the other equation. By 1915, both sides had learned that attacking infantry needed the artillery to destroy enemy trenches first, to cut the wire, silence the guns, break the defenders. The bombardments grew longer. Days, then weeks. The theory was reasonable. The problem was that the bombardment, while it killed, also warned. And it turned the ground in front of the trench into a moonscape, a churned, waterlogged field of craters that the attacking infantry then had to cross. The solution created a new problem. The pattern repeated at enormous cost for years. On the 22nd of April, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, the war added a third element. German forces released 168 tons of chlorine gas along a 4-mile front. A yellow-green cloud drifted toward the Allied lines. Those who breathed it in large quantities died in the trench, their lungs destroyed from the inside. Within 10 minutes, a gap 4 miles wide had been torn in the Allied line. Gas had arrived, and with it, the understanding that this war would not respect any rules that previous wars had observed. The respirators that followed were crude, uncomfortable, and only partially effective. Wearing one, a man could barely see and barely breathe. Not wearing one in a gas attack meant dying in minutes. The war had found a new way to make survival feel like punishment. On the evening of the 24th of December, 1914, something happened on the Western Front that no general had ordered and no military doctrine had anticipated. Along portions of the front line, not all of it, but enough to be remembered, small lights appeared on the German parapet. Candles, improvised Christmas trees, and then voices, carols in German. And from the British side, after a moment of uncertainty, a response. By morning, in multiple sectors, men who had spent 4 months trying to kill each other had climbed out of their trenches and were standing in no man's land, shaking hands. They exchanged cigarettes and food. They showed each other photographs of their families. In a few documented cases, they played football on the frozen ground between the lines. They buried their dead. Men who had been lying in no man's land for weeks, who neither side could retrieve without being shot. They helped each other do what armies in the middle of a war cannot normally do, acknowledge that the man on the other side was a man. The truce lasted, in some places, through Christmas Day. In a few areas, into the new year. Then, the war resumed. The men who had shaken hands went back to their trenches, and when the orders came, tried to kill each other again. Not because they wanted to, because the machine that had brought them there was still running, and no one, in December of 1914, had yet found the switch. From where I am in 2070, the Western Front looks like this, a catastrophic failure of imagination, compounded daily by the unwillingness of institutions to update their assumptions in the face of evidence. The military commanders of 1914 had been trained for a different kind of war, fast, decisive, defined by maneuver. When they found themselves commanding a different kind of war entirely, many of them continued planning for the war they had been trained for and ordering their men to fight it. The machine gun made the frontal infantry attack suicidal. They knew this. The casualty reports told them so, every week, for years. And yet the frontal attack remained, because no one could agree on what to replace it with, and because stopping the attack meant admitting that the strategy had been wrong. This is the pattern that repeats, not only in war, but in every institution that has ever been caught by a change it refused to see coming. The trench is the permanent form of that refusal. The man at the parapet, looking at the same 20 yards of wire he looked at yesterday, is its most honest symbol. In 1914 and 1915, the 2 years this episode covers, the Western Front produced approximately 1 million dead. The machine was running. The tactics had not changed. And somewhere behind the lines, far from the mud, men were drawing arrows on maps. The arrows pointed forward. They always pointed forward. In 1916, they would attempt, at a place called Verdun and a river called the Somme, to make those arrows real. The numbers from those two battles are not numbers I'm going to give you now. They deserve their own silence. They will get it in the next chapter.
In 1916, the commanders on both sides decided that the problem was not the tactic, it was the scale. That what was needed was not a new approach, but a bigger version of the old one. At Verdun in February, Germany committed to a battle of pure attrition, designed not to take ground, but to bleed France to death. At the Somme, in July, Britain launched the largest offensive in its history. Don't lose the next episode of Tales from 2070.